Hello to everyone tuning in. I got off work 3 hours early, planning to hide in the closet and surprise my husband. But instead, I saw him walk in, holding my sister-in-law in his arms. I smiled coldly. If they wanted to act, then I'd put on a show for them. Some jokes, seemingly harmless, can become the moments that expose the most bitter truths of our lives. And I, a woman who has lived nearly half her life, never thought that a moment of childish impulse would reveal the true face of the man I had loved and trusted for years. That day, I left work 3 hours earlier than usual. The power went out unexpectedly at the office, so the entire staff was sent home. As I walked out of the building, I felt an unusual sense of relief. It had been so long since I'd had a free afternoon like this. I suddenly thought, why not give my husband a surprise today? On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store to get the ingredients for the pot roast that Mike loved most, carefully picking out some good vegetables and a nice cut of beef, thinking I would make a wonderful dinner, just the two of us, having a warm, cozy meal. In my head, all I could picture were simple, happy images. He'd be surprised, he'd smile, and maybe he'd even pull me in for a hug like when we were newlyweds. I had no idea what was waiting for me. When I got home, I found the front door unlocked. I stepped inside to a strangely quiet house. I figured my husband, Mike, wasn't home yet, and my mother-in-law wasn't there either. An idea suddenly sparked in my mind, a very childish, very silly one. I wanted to hide, wait for him to get home, and then jump out to scare him, just like I did once when we were first married. He had been so startled he almost dropped his phone. The memory made me chuckle to myself. I quietly tiptoed into our bedroom, opened the closet door, and slipped inside. The space was cramped, and the familiar scent of our clothes made me feel a little ridiculous. I told myself I just had to wait a little while. He was probably on his way home. But I never expected that it wouldn't be just my husband who entered that room. I had just gently closed the closet door, not even having a chance to steady my breath, when I heard the front door open, followed by footsteps and a sound I could never mistake. The distinct, rhythmic click-clack of high heels echoed through the quiet house. My heart suddenly began to pound, a sense of unease creeping into my soul. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back of the closet, not daring to move. The bedroom door swung open, and then I heard the voice of a woman who was no stranger to me, Jessica, my sister-in-law. Before I could even process what was happening, I heard footsteps approaching the bed, and then came a sight that, even now, makes my heart feel like it's being squeezed in a vice. My husband, Michael, walked into the room with Jessica. They weren't keeping their distance, not like the brother-in-law and sister-in-law they pretended to be in front of me. They were holding each other. It was a natural, familiar embrace, without a hint of awkwardness. Standing in the closet, my entire body felt frozen. My ears were ringing, but their every word pierced through, sharp and cold. Jessica rested her head on my husband's shoulder, her voice soft but every word clear. Being with Kevin is suffocating. I feel like I can only breathe when I'm with you. That voice was no longer the voice of the meek sister-in-law I thought I knew. It was soft, whiny, and so familiar that it sent a shiver down my spine. My husband didn't push her away. Instead, he raised a hand to stroke her hair, his voice low and soothing. I told you, just let me handle it. Don't worry so much. Let me handle it. A phrase he had said to me countless times before, and now he was using that very same line on his own sister-in-law. I couldn't feel anything anymore. Not anger, not the heartbreak people always talk about, just emptiness. A chilling, hollow void. I stood in the closet, my hands clenched into fists, my nails digging so deep into my palms that I didn't even feel the pain. I only felt that everything in my life, in this family, was shattering into pieces. They continued to talk, whispered words, soft laughs. Each one was like a knife scoring another line across my heart. I didn't step out. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I don't know why. In that very moment, I laughed. A quiet, soft laugh, but so cold that even I felt like a stranger to myself. Only one thought ran through my mind. Asterisk. So, it's been like this for a long time. So, I'm the last one to know. Asterisk. And then another thought emerged, no longer one of pain, but of clarity. I asked myself, if I step out now, what will I do? Cause a scene? Scream and cry? Or beg for an explanation? No. I refused to become that pathetic woman. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my heart, and stood motionless in the darkness of the closet, listening to everything, memorizing every word, every tone. And then, I smiled. This time, it wasn't an unconscious reaction, but a deliberate one. Fine. If you like acting out a play behind my back, then let me direct a bigger one for you. I don't know how long I stood in there. I only know that when they finally left the room, when the door clicked shut, I slowly opened the closet. The room was exactly as it had been when I first walked in. The only difference was that the woman who stepped out of that closet was no longer the same person she had been just a few hours ago. I gently smoothed my hair, straightened my clothes, and looked in the mirror. My face was normal. No one could tell what had just happened. I walked out of the bedroom and went down to the kitchen, placing the bag of groceries on the counter. Everything was still neat, the house still so familiar, but my heart had been irrevocably changed. I no longer wanted to ask questions. I no longer wanted to believe. I had only one thing left to do: make them pay the price. Not with tears, but with the very drama they had started. And this time, I would be the one writing the script. I stood in the kitchen for a long time that day, my hand still resting on the bag of groceries I hadn't even unpacked. The beef I had bought for dinner was still in its plastic wrap. The fresh vegetables still had droplets of water on them from the store's misters. Everything before me was the same as it had been, only I was no longer the same. And in that very moment, standing there frozen, events from the past few years began to replay in my mind. Clear as day, every face, every word, every time I had told myself, asterisk, you're just overthinking it. Asterisk, Mike and I had been married for 5 years. Compared to many, our marriage wasn't extravagant, but from the outside, it was what people would call stable. He worked in sales for a construction supply company, and I was an accountant for a private firm. I managed most of the household finances, from both our paychecks to all major and minor expenses. I was the one who kept the records, did the math, and planned for the future. Mike used to tell people, I let my wife handle the money for peace of mind. I'm a big spender. Every time I heard that, my heart would warm, thinking my husband trusted me so completely. My husband's family wasn't large. His father had passed away early, leaving just his mother, Carol. Mike was the eldest son, and then there was his younger brother, Kevin. Kevin was nearly 4 years younger than Mike and had a completely different personality. If Mike was calm and reserved in public, knowing when to compromise, Kevin was the impulsive type, a man who did whatever he pleased, living for the moment, refusing to be tied down by any rules. From the moment I married into the family, I could see Kevin wasn't serious about building a career. He bounced from job to job, working in retail one day. Then a few months later, I'd hear he'd gone in with a friend to open a coffee shop. Before long, the shop would close down. No one knew how much money he made, if any. We only saw that his clothes were always flashy, and he was constantly upgrading his phone. His buddies were always calling him out for drinks, day or night. Some months, Kevin didn't give his mother a single dollar, but he loved to show off to outsiders, obsessed with his image and hearing people praise him. My mother-in-law, Carol, doted on her youngest son. She often said, Kevin's just had some bad luck. He hasn't found his moment yet. He's the sharpest one in the family. After a while, I got used to it. In this house, whatever Kevin did, right or wrong, there was always an excuse ready to defend him. At the time, I just found it frustrating. I didn't think much more of it. It was only much later that I understood how that blind indulgence had warped the entire foundation of our family. About a year after I married Mike, Kevin brought Jessica home to introduce her. Jessica looked so young back then, fair skin, a small face, and she spoke so softly, bowing her head and saying yes, ma'am, to everyone. She worked at a makeup counter in a department store, and her family wasn't well off. So at first, everyone thought she was a sweet, easygoing girl. I even thought so myself back then. I felt sorry for her, thinking she would have a hard life married to someone like Kevin. And sure enough, Jessica's life after the wedding was not as peaceful as one might imagine. Kevin was not only immature, but he also had a bizarre, possessive streak. It wasn't the jealousy of a man deeply in love, but the kind that treats his wife as property. He had to be in control, to assert his authority, to make others obey him. Kevin would grab Jessica's phone and check it any time he wanted. He read her messages with friends and colleagues, male or female. One evening at dinner, just because he saw his wife smile while texting someone, Kevin snatched the phone, slammed it on the table, and snarled, "Who are you smiling at like that? You're a married woman. Stop acting like a slut." Jessica could only lower her head, mumbling an explanation that she was texting a female coworker. But Kevin never cared to listen to the whole story. The more she tried to explain, the louder he got. My mother-in-law, sitting right there, didn't reprimand her son. Instead, she just sighed and said, "A married woman should know better. Don't give him a reason to get angry." Hearing that, I felt a lump form in my throat. But since it was my brother-in-law's marriage, I didn't feel it was my place to interfere too much. One time, things went even further. That day, Jessica got off work 15 minutes late because the store was doing its end-of-month inventory. As she pulled into the driveway, before she could even get off her scooter, Kevin burst out of the house, slapped her so hard her helmet flew off, and started yelling in front of everyone. He shouted, "Where have you been? Crawling back at this hour? Were you meeting some guy?" Jessica broke down crying, her words trembling as she explained that her manager had kept her late for inventory, but Kevin didn't believe her. He snatched her phone and smashed it on the concrete, shattering it. I stood at the kitchen door, watching, a cold chill running through me. And yet, my mother-in-law just ran out, pulled Kevin's arm, and said, "That's enough. Let's go inside. The neighbors will talk. Whatever it is, settle it behind closed doors." Not a single word of reprimand, no mention of right or wrong. After that incident, Jessica started turning to our mother-in-law to vent her frustrations. One day, while I was cooking, I heard her in the living room, sniffling, saying that living with Kevin was like walking on eggshells. If she came home even a little late, she was interrogated and accused. My mother-in-law just waved her hand and said, "Men get hot-headed sometimes. A woman has to know when to be soft, when to yield, to keep the peace." And just like that, all of Jessica's frustrations were brushed aside as if they were normal. No one truly stood up for her. No one made Kevin change. And so, from then on, Jessica changed her approach. She stopped seeking out her mother-in-law and started turning to Mike instead. At first, it was about small things, things that would easily soften anyone's heart. Sometimes, she'd ask her brother-in-law to drive her to the store because she was afraid Kevin was angry. Other times, she'd call Mike out to the front yard to talk for a few minutes, saying that, in this house, he was the only one who would listen to her. One day, I saw her sitting on the back steps, her eyes red and swollen, while Mike stood beside her, his voice low and gentle. "Okay, take it easy. I'll talk to Kevin." To be honest, the first few times I saw scenes like that, I didn't suspect a thing. On the contrary, I thought my husband was a good man. I thought that, in a house where everyone was either biased or indifferent, Mike was the only one willing to speak up for his sister-in-law, and that was the right thing to do. I even told him once, "Don't get too involved. You might hurt Kevin's pride." Mike just turned to me with a kind smile and said, "I just feel sorry for her, that's all. Who wants to get tangled in someone else's mess?" Back then, I believed him. I believed my husband was just a good listener. I believed Jessica was just an unfortunate girl, desperately seeking a temporary shoulder to lean on in her new family. I believed their conversations were purely based on sympathy, and because I believed so completely, I failed to see what was growing right in front of my eyes. Looking back now, I see that some dangers don't arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic collision. They begin when people allow themselves to cross a small boundary, and then another, until things have gone too far, and no one is clear-headed enough to stop. And there I was, naively thinking it was just compassion, never realizing I was nurturing a threat in my own home. But anything that starts with the word pity can easily slide into another kind of feeling, especially when the people involved intentionally let it slide, with no one willing to pull it back. After the phase where Jessica frequently sought out Mike to complain, things in our house began to change in a way that was hard to define. To an outsider, it would still look like a normal family. But for someone living inside it, like me, I could feel it, bit by bit. The line between right and wrong was slowly being erased. It started with text messages that arrived in the evening. We would be eating dinner, or sometimes we were already in bed, about to sleep, and Mike's phone screen would light up repeatedly. He'd pick it up, his brow furrowing slightly, and then take the phone out to the balcony or down to the yard. At first, he'd offer a brief explanation. "It's Jessica, probably fighting with Kevin again." I'd hear that and let it go, still thinking she was just looking for her brother-in-law to vent. Once, I accidentally saw a few lines of a text flash on the screen when Mike's phone was on the table. It was just a glimpse, but *enough for me to read. Asterisk, Kevin's accusing me again. I'm so tired. Asterisk, another message followed immediately after. Asterisk, I don't know who else to talk to. Asterisk, at that moment, I genuinely felt sorry for her. A young woman married to a jealous man, constantly being questioned, with no one in the family to support her. If she reached out to her brother-in-law for a few words of comfort, it didn't seem like a big deal. But the texts became more frequent. At first, it was every few days, then it became almost every night. Mike went from replying with a few short sentences to spending longer and longer periods on his phone. One evening, I was clearing the dinner table and called him to eat 2 or 3 times, but he remained in the living room, eyes glued to the screen, fingers typing furiously. When I reminded him again, he just said, "You go ahead and eat. I just need to answer her. She's really upset." Once is fine, twice is forgivable, but when it happened over and over, I started to feel uneasy. Then, it moved from texts to phone calls. One night, around 11 p.m., I had just drifted off to sleep when I heard his phone vibrate. Mike sat up instantly, looked at the screen, and then walked out of the room. I lay there, listening to his hushed voice in the hallway. I couldn't make out what he was saying, only catching fragments like, "Yeah, I know," and "Okay, don't cry, just try to calm down." He came back to bed much later that night, and I lay with my back to him. A knot of something unsettling in my stomach that I couldn't name. I started paying more attention, and the more I watched, the more I saw Mike dedicating an amount of time to Jessica that was far beyond what was normal for a brother-in-law. One Sunday, I had just finished cooking lunch and couldn't find him anywhere. When I brought the food to the table, I saw him standing at the end of the driveway, talking to Jessica. They talked for so long that I had to reheat the soup. When I asked him about it, Mike answered curtly, "She's having trouble with Kevin. I was just listening to her for a minute." He said it with an attitude that made me feel like I had asked something trivial. The breaking point came one afternoon when Kevin came home drunk from a long lunch. Jessica ran over to our house, her eyes red, hair disheveled, and her face pale. She walked in, sat down on the couch, and burst into tears. I was in the kitchen preparing vegetables and came out when I heard the noise. I saw that Mike was already sitting right next to her. Jessica sobbed about how Kevin had gone through her purse, her phone, and called her worthless. As she spoke, she leaned closer and closer to Mike, her voice growing softer, her hand constantly wiping away tears. I stood there watching, and a strange, uncomfortable feeling washed over me. It wasn't because my sister-in-law was crying in my house, but because of how close she was sitting to my husband, so close their knees were almost touching. And Mike didn't seem to think anything was wrong. He poured her water and handed her tissues. When I gently made a suggestion, just one simple sentence, "Maybe you should give her a little more space. The neighbors might get the wrong idea," Mike turned and snapped at me. His voice was so cold and irritated that it stopped me in my tracks. "Can't you see she's suffering? You're her sister-in-law. Don't you have any compassion?" That question felt like a bucket of ice water thrown in my face. I stood there, stunned and hurt. Since when did my very reasonable request become cruel and petty? Before I could say another word, my mother-in-law walked in. Without even hearing the full story, she immediately took their side. "If she doesn't turn to her brother, who else can she turn to? Your mind is so dirty. The family is in turmoil. And instead of comforting her, you're sulking. And just like that, in one afternoon, I went from being a wife feeling insecure about her husband to being cast as a petty, selfish shrew. And Jessica, whose behavior was becoming increasingly inappropriate, was transformed into a poor, pitiable victim who needed protection. She sat there, her eyes still red, her lips pursed, looking at me with an expression that was both weak and wounded. If I hadn't been standing in the middle of that house, I might have believed she was completely innocent too. From that day on, I began to feel like an outsider in my own home. Whenever Jessica was around, the atmosphere changed. If I so much as frowned or stayed silent for too long, my mother-in-law would make some passive-aggressive comment, as if I were making things difficult for her. And Mike grew increasingly impatient with me. One time, I simply asked him, "Is something wrong with Jessica? She's been calling you all the time?" He immediately shot back, "Can you not turn a small thing into a big deal? She's already miserable, don't make it worse." His words choked me. It was clear that Jessica wasn't the only one in a difficult position. I was his wife, I lived in this house, I had feelings and self-respect, but somehow, my feelings had become insignificant. All it took was for Jessica to cry or complain, and everyone would side with her. If I uttered a single word of caution, I became the petty, unreasonable woman. Then, something happened that made it impossible for me to keep deceiving myself. I came home from work a little earlier than planned one day. As I walked through the back door, I heard quiet voices coming from the side of the house. I was about to go straight into the kitchen when I saw Mike standing with his back to me and Jessica facing him. They were talking in low tones. Before I could even take another step, I saw Jessica's hand reach out and cover Mike's. It wasn't an accidental touch. It was a firm, deliberate grasp. I froze on the spot. At that exact moment, Mike turned his head and saw me. He flinched, pulling his hand away almost instantly. Jessica let go too, but then just lowered her head as if nothing had happened. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I could hear it. I walked closer, looked at them both, and asked as calmly as I could, though my insides were in turmoil. "She's upset about her marriage. I was just giving her some advice. That was it. No further explanation, no looking me in the eye for more than a second." Then Jessica looked up, a faint smile on her face, a smile that seemed harmless but sent a chill down my spine. She said softly, "Don't think badly of me, Kate. I just see Mike as someone I can lean on." It sounded reasonable, but for some reason, hearing it made my skin crawl. What kind of support requires holding hands? What kind of support requires late-night calls and texts, and makes my husband skip our family dinners? I wanted to ask them directly, but I swallowed the words back down. I looked at Mike. He avoided my gaze. I looked at Jessica. She lowered her eyes, her expression as innocent as ever. And in the end, like so many times before, I told myself that maybe things hadn't crossed a line yet, that maybe it was just a blurry boundary between sympathy and closeness. Maybe I was being overly sensitive because I had seen too many red flags in a short period. But no matter how much I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't deny one thing. From that day forward, a real and heavy sense of unease had settled deep in my heart. I had hoped that the unease in my heart was just a temporary feeling, that things would calm down once Kevin became less volatile, once Jessica learned to keep a better distance, and once Mike understood what was bothering me. But life doesn't always go the way we hope. Some things, once they cross the first boundary, don't stop. They just keep pushing, little by little, until the person watching can't even tell where the line is anymore. After the time I saw Jessica holding Mike's hand in the yard, things at home didn't improve as I'd hoped. On the contrary, the atmosphere grew even more suffocating. Kevin seemed to be losing more and more control. He wasn't just checking his wife's phone anymore. He started monitoring Jessica like she was a criminal. One time, walking past their living room, I noticed a small camera mounted in the corner of the wall. I thought Kevin had installed it for security, but I later overheard that he had put it there specifically to watch what Jessica did, where she went, and who she talked to when she was at home. This gave Jessica even more reason to come over to our house. Sometimes she'd say it was too stifling over there, that she was afraid of being accused even for breathing. Other times, she'd say Kevin had reviewed the camera footage and started another fight. She couldn't take it anymore and had to come over for a while. At first, my mother-in-law would offer a few token words like, "A husband and wife should settle their issues behind closed doors. Don't keep running over here." But that's all she'd say, and she still let Jessica come over. And Mike was always ready with a welcoming word. "Let her be, Mom. Let her have some peace and quiet here." Gradually, Jessica's constant presence in our house became a normal occurrence. And when something becomes normal, people tend to overlook the things that aren't. One evening, I had just finished cooking and walked into the living room to find Jessica already there, hugging a pillow, looking miserable. Mike was sitting right next to her, leaning towards her, asking questions in a low voice. My entrance didn't startle them. No one felt the need to adjust their position. That very naturalness was what bothered me the most. Then one day, right in front of me, Jessica became so comfortable that she dropped all pretense of basic courtesy. The whole family was watching TV after dinner. I had just come out of the kitchen and saw Jessica sitting so close to Mike that there was virtually no space between them. When a scary scene came on, she reflexively leaned her head right onto Mike's shoulder. Mike didn't move away. He just chuckled softly and said, "What's there to be so scared of?" My entire body tensed up. I stood there for a few seconds, unable to believe what I was seeing. If I hadn't been there, how much more casual would they have been? I set a glass of water down on the table, a little harder than usual. The sharp clink of glass on wood made them both turn. Jessica straightened up, but her face showed no sign of embarrassment. Mike, however, looked at me with a flicker of annoyance, as if I was the one who had ruined the mood, not them. I tried to keep my voice as steady as possible, saying only one quiet thing. "Jessica, you should sit up properly." I didn't yell or scold. For me, that simple reminder was an act of great restraint. But Jessica looked up at me with a hurt expression and slowly replied, "I'm under so much pressure already. Please don't make things harder for me." Hearing that, I almost laughed out loud. She was leaning on my husband, sitting right next to him in front of me, and yet I was the one making things hard for her? Before I could respond, Mike turned and reprimanded me directly. "You're being unreasonable. She's going through enough without you adding to it." His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough to make me freeze. I looked at him, thinking I must have misheard. I wasn't the one sitting too close to my sister-in-law. I wasn't the one letting her lean on my shoulder. Yet, with one simple remark, I had become the aggressor. In this house, right and wrong had apparently become completely inverted. My mother-in-law, hearing the commotion, came out from the kitchen. She didn't bother asking for details. The moment she saw Jessica's tearful face, she just sighed and said, "I think Jessica is a much kinder person than you are. She's put up with enough. What more do you want?" That comment was like a sharp, clean cut, but it hurt deeply. I stood in the middle of the living room, in front of my husband, next to my mother-in-law, facing my sister-in-law, and suddenly felt as alone as a complete stranger. Never had I felt so clearly the sensation of being isolated in my own home. From that day on, Jessica grew bolder. She no longer maintained the timid, cautious act from before. Every time she came over, she would walk straight in and sit next to Mike as if it were a habit. Her mouth always full of stories about being suspected, controlled, and suffocated by her husband. Every word she spoke was wrapped in an air of vulnerability. But the more I listened, the more I felt there was something very calculated about that vulnerability, very skilled at choosing the right time and the right person to cling to. And Mike, at some point, had stopped being just a sympathetic brother-in-law. He had started to take her side completely. Then, the thing I had feared most finally happened, even though I hadn't dared to name it yet. One night, around 10 p.m., there was a loud banging on the front door. Kevin burst in, completely drunk, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes a mess. The moment he saw Jessica sitting in our living room, he lunged forward, grabbed her arm, and yanked her to her feet. The house erupted in chaos. Jessica screamed, "You're hurting me!" And Mike immediately stepped between them, his voice sharp. "What the hell are you doing? If you have something to say, say it properly." Kevin shoved his brother's hand away, pointed a finger at Jessica, and cursed. "What are you doing here? Having a heart-to-heart or something else? You think I'm an idiot?" His words sent a chill down my spine. Not because they were crude, but because for the first time, something I had only dared to suspect in my own mind had been spoken aloud by someone else. In that instant, I saw Mike's face darken, and Jessica immediately covered her face and began to sob. My mother-in-law rushed in to intervene, yelling at Kevin for causing a scene in the middle of the night. After a struggle, Kevin managed to drag Jessica home, but the story didn't end there. The next morning, Jessica came over again, looking even more pathetic than before. There was a bruise on her wrist, her eyes were puffy, and her voice was hoarse. She sat in front of Mike and cried, telling him how her husband had hit her, accused her, and called her a worthless woman. As she spoke, she kept looking at Mike, as if clinging to the only person who could save her. I sat nearby, but I felt invisible, because the look in Mike's eyes as he watched Jessica at that moment was completely different. It was no longer the look of pity, no longer the momentary softness of a man defending the weak. It was something deeper, heavier, more dangerous. A feeling that, just by looking at it, you knew the boundary had long since been crossed. And it was then that I began to understand something I had been deliberately avoiding. Pity, if misplaced, if allowed to continue for too long, if nurtured by one person and exploited by another, can very easily become the most beautiful excuse for a betrayal. After the night I saw the look in Mike's eyes for Jessica, the feeling in my heart was no longer a vague, uncertain unease. It transformed into a weight, heavy as a stone, pressing on my chest. I didn't say anything, nor did I cause a scene. But from that day on, I started paying much closer attention to everything in the house, especially the finances. I had always been the one to manage our main expenses, from utility bills and groceries to the joint savings account for my husband and me. I meticulously recorded everything almost every month. Some things, when you're happy, you call trust. But when your heart is broken, those very numbers are the first things to reveal the truth. It was the end of the month, and as usual, I sat down to review our family's finances. At first, it was just a routine, as I always reconciled our accounts once a month. But when I opened the banking app, I suddenly paused. The balance in our joint savings account was significantly lower than I remembered. It wasn't off by a few $100s from miscellaneous spending. It was a very large amount, enough to make anyone's heart stop. I thought I might be misremembering. I tried to reassure myself that there must have been some large expense this month that I hadn't updated yet. But the more I checked my notebook, the more I cross-referenced past transactions, the colder I felt. There it was. A large sum of money had been withdrawn just 3 days earlier. And the thing that made my hands start to tremble was the transaction description, which simply read, *personal loan. I sat there, staring at my phone screen, frozen. A personal loan to whom? I hardly needed to guess. I clicked for more details on the recipient. The account holder's name appeared clearly, spelled out perfectly. Jessica. I stared at that name for a long, long time. So long that my eyes burned, but I couldn't blink. My fingers grew cold. So, it wasn't just texts, lingering glances, sitting shoulder to shoulder, or overly defensive remarks. There was money between them now. And once money is involved, it's no longer just pity. No man who simply feels sorry for his sister-in-law would secretly withdraw a large sum from his and his wife's joint savings to give to her without saying a single word to his wife. I sat still for a few more minutes, then stood up and walked straight into the bedroom. Mike had just gotten home from work and was changing his clothes. Seeing me walk in with a strange expression, he asked casually, "What's up?" That casualness made my skin crawl. I held up my phone, putting it right in front of his face, pointing to the transaction I had just found, and asked directly, "What is this?" Mike glanced at the screen. I saw it clearly. His eyes froze for a split second. But just as quickly, he regained his composure, his voice even, as if discussing something trivial. "Oh, I transferred some money to Jessica. She wants to rent her own place for a while, to get away from Kevin for a bit." My throat tightened as I listened. A huge sum of money, taken from our joint account, and to him, it was just some money. I struggled to keep my voice from shaking. You gave her that much money without even discussing it with me? At this, Mike's expression changed. The initial calm disappeared, replaced by that familiar irritation he always showed when I touched on something he didn't want to explain. He yanked open a drawer, pulled out a shirt, and said curtly, "What was there to discuss? She's my family. She's in trouble, so I helped her out a bit." I looked him straight in the face, not backing down for the first time. Helped her a bit? Or helped her so much it's become a habit? The air in the room grew thick. Mike whipped around, his eyes darkening. I didn't stop. I asked the question that had been burning inside me for so long. Tell me clearly, are you helping your sister-in-law, or are you helping someone else? The moment the question left my lips, the room felt like it was being suffocated. Mike froze, his face turning grim, his voice rising in anger. What kind of thing is that to say? I shot back immediately, no longer holding back. I'm saying what I see. For how long now have you seen her as your sister-in-law, or as something else? You know the answer better than anyone. For the first time in a long while, my eyes were dry. All I felt was a growing coldness. Just then, Jessica appeared in the doorway. She must have heard the commotion and been standing there for a while. She showed no sign of being flustered, as one would expect when caught in such a situation. Instead, she stood still, her back straight, her eyes fixed on me for a long moment. In her gaze, there was no trace of the weak, pitiful look she usually wore. She didn't say a word, but that look was enough for me to understand. She wasn't afraid. In fact, somewhere in that gaze, there was even a hint of a challenge. My mother-in-law, hearing the argument, rushed in. "What's going on?" she asked, but before I could answer, Mike cut in, his voice frustrated. "She's jumping to conclusions again. She saw I helped Jessica, with a little money, and she's acting like she caught a criminal." Hearing that, my mother-in-law didn't bother to find out the truth. She turned and glared at me. "What's wrong with you now? It's family helping family. Can't you let it be?" I turned to look at her, my heart filled with bitterness. Helping how? A large sum was taken from our joint savings, and I, the wife, wasn't even told. Carol just waved her hand dismissively, her voice sharp. "Oh, please, it's your husband's money. If he wants to help his sister, what's wrong with that? It's this jealous, accusatory attitude of yours that's causing all the trouble in this house." I stared at her, unblinking. So, in her eyes, I was the one with the problem, while her son secretly transferring money to his sister-in-law was perfectly normal. I had never felt so blatantly insulted. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife when suddenly we heard a car screech to a halt outside, followed by heavy footsteps storming into the house. Kevin burst into the room, his face flushed, his eyes wild like a cornered animal. He pointed a shaking finger at Jessica, his voice hoarse with rage. "What are you doing here? You think I don't know? You can do this with anyone else, but with my own brother? What do you take me for?" The entire family froze. I never expected Kevin to show up at that exact moment, let alone to say it all out loud like that. Jessica's face went white. But what hurt me more was Mike's reaction. He didn't side with the truth. He wasn't scared or defensive like an innocent person being falsely accused. Instead, he lunged forward, physically shielding Jessica, and shoved Kevin back hard. His voice was a low, angry growl. "You're taking this too far. If there's a problem, we can talk about it civilly." I stood there, watching my husband's hands move to protect his sister-in-law, while his own brother was pushed away like a troublemaker. In that single moment, any remaining illusion I had shattered completely. If it was just pity between them, Mike would not have reacted so instinctively. If he was innocent, he would not have chosen to protect Jessica first. And if this was all a misunderstanding, I would not be standing in that room feeling like a third wheel in my own marriage. The argument that followed was a chaotic mess. Kevin was yelling, my mother-in-law was screaming, Jessica was crying, and Mike was snapping at everyone, trying to shut it all down. But I didn't say another word. I backed out of that room, went straight to the kitchen, and sat down on a familiar plastic chair. Outside, the chaos continued, but inside my head, All the pieces from the past few months were fitting together, clicking into place with a chilling precision. The late-night texts, the baseless defenses, the averted eyes, the hand-holding in the yard, the secret money transfers, they were no longer scattered dots. That night, when everything finally quieted down, I sat alone in the dark. I didn't cry. I no longer felt the sharp pain of a woman betrayed for the first time. I just felt clearer than ever before. I had no more doubts. The only thing I lacked was proof. And if fate had let me see this much, then I would get the rest myself. That night, when everything finally quieted down, I sat alone in the dark. I didn't cry. I no longer felt the sharp pain of a woman betrayed for the first time. I just felt clearer than ever before. I had no more doubts. The only thing I lacked was proof. And luckily for me, from the moment I stood in that closet earlier that afternoon, almost by instinct, I had done the most important thing. When I heard the bedroom door open, when I saw Mike holding Jessica right in front of me, my hand was shaking so badly I thought I would drop my phone. But in that daze, I hit the record button. It wasn't because I was some mastermind. It was because in that moment I understood one thing very clearly. If I just burst out and caused a scene, at most I would get a few denials, a few fake tears, and in the end, I would be the one accused of making a scene. But if I could capture what was happening in front of me, then no matter how eloquently they tried to talk their way out of it later, they could never erase it. I stood in that closet, holding my breath, and recorded the entire scene. Jessica, leaning on Mike's shoulder, him stroking her hair, the two of them speaking to each other in that soft, intimate tone reserved for lovers. The video wasn't long, but it was clear enough that just watching it once made my heart turn to ice. After they left the room, I stepped out, straightened my clothes, put my phone in my purse, and went down to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. I knew then that I couldn't be hasty. That evening, I served dinner as usual. I set out the plates and silverware, reheated the pot roast that had gone cold, and sat down at the table like a wife with nothing out of the ordinary on her mind. Perhaps it was my very calmness that startled Mike. Throughout the meal, he occasionally looked up at me, his eyes searching, and I, in turn, acted even more gently than usual. I even offered food to my mother-in-law and made some small talk with Jessica when she came over to sit with us, as she always did. My placid demeanor made it impossible for either of them to guess what I was thinking. It wasn't until we were almost done eating that Mike finally spoke, feigning a casual tone. "You got home early today, huh?" I put down my bowl, looked up at him, and said just one thing. "Yeah, I came home early to see if there were any surprises." As the words left my mouth, Mike's hand, which was reaching for something, froze midair. It was just for a second, but I saw it clearly. Jessica, sitting nearby with her head down, tensed up, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. No one said another word, but the silence that followed confirmed what I already knew. They were guilty. In the days that followed, I changed my approach completely. I stopped being jealous. I stopped making passive-aggressive remarks. I didn't bring up the money transferred to Jessica, and I certainly didn't mention the afternoon in the closet. I chose the hardest path for a betrayed woman. Silence. I was silent so I could watch, silent so I could listen, and silent so I could wait for them to expose themselves further. Sometimes, while washing dishes, I'd hear Mike and Jessica's quiet laughter from the living room, and my stomach would still clench, but I forced it down. I knew that if I lost my composure now, all I'd have was one video clip and a heap of suspicion. I needed more. I started paying attention to Mike's phone. One evening, while he was in the shower, I took the opportunity to check it. But what I found both chilled me and made me more clear-headed than ever. There were virtually no messages between him and Jessica. The call log was completely clean. It had been wiped so thoroughly that not a single trace was left. That very cleanliness was the most damning evidence of all. Innocent people don't need to erase everything so meticulously. I placed the phone back where I found it, my heart as cold as ice. So, these two were not only cheating, but they were also very careful. From that day on, I put on an even better performance. I made a point of acting like I trusted Mike completely. One day, in front of my mother-in-law, I even said, "Work has been so busy lately. It's a good thing Jessica comes over. It makes the house feel less empty." After I said that, even Jessica looked up at me, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She probably couldn't understand why someone who had been so obviously annoyed could change their tune so quickly. But just as quickly, she relaxed. People like Jessica tend to believe whatever benefits them. Seeing me back down, she thought I was scared. Seeing me stay silent, she thought I was stupid. At the same time, I secretly contacted an old friend named David. We used to work together before he moved into IT. I didn't tell him the whole story, just a brief version. I needed to recover deleted data from a phone and wanted to know how to track financial transactions if something unusual occurred. David didn't ask many questions. He just told me to send him what I could get, and he'd see what he could do. From that moment on, I knew I had entered a new phase. I was no longer a woman sitting in the dark, consumed by suspicion. I was no longer the one standing in the kitchen while others tore my self-respect to shreds. Mike and Jessica might have thought they were leading me through their little play, but they were wrong. From now on, I was the one writing the next act. I was no longer the passive victim. I was holding the script. After asking David for help, I lived in a strange state of being. During the day, I went to work, laughed, and talked with my colleagues as if nothing was wrong. At night, I came home, cooked dinner, cleaned the house, and played the part of a normal wife so well that sometimes I even scared myself. But as soon as the bedroom door closed, or when the house was quiet, I would sit alone with my phone, waiting for the smallest signal, like someone waiting for a verdict to be read. I knew that once I started down this path, sooner or later, I would see everything I no longer wanted to believe. 2 days later, David called me back. He spoke in a low voice from the start, as if he suspected this was something serious. He said the data on Mike's phone had been deleted quite thoroughly, but it wasn't impossible to trace. Some text messages were gone for good, but he was able to recover fragments from the cache and cloud backups. I stood on the balcony at work, taking the call, my hand gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. When David sent the file, I couldn't bring myself to open it right away. I stood there for a long time before I finally had the courage to click on it. The first few lines that appeared on the screen were enough to make my throat close up. They weren't the vague, comforting words I had once deluded myself into believing. This was the language of people who had crossed the line a long, long time ago. One text from Jessica read, "Don't leave me. I'm only putting up with Kevin for you. That one short sentence felt like a hammer blow to my head. So, the act of the pitiful sister-in-law wasn't something new. It had been going on long enough for Jessica to dare say something like that. Long enough for my husband to let her believe she had a right to make such demands. I scrolled down further, feeling colder with every word. The messages were fragmented, not continuous, but they were enough to show that this wasn't just about secret meetings. It was a relationship that had been going on for quite some time. They arranged to meet at odd hours with a practiced ease, speaking to each other in a way no one would ever mistake for a brother-in-law and sister-in-law. I sat at my desk, my eyes glued to the screen until they burned. One of Mike's texts read, "Just be patient. I'll arrange everything. In another, Jessica replied, "You promised. Don't make me wait for nothing." The more I read, the more I understood how deeply I had been deceived. But that wasn't all. When David sent me a summary of the financial transactions he had cross-referenced from the phone and old bank notification emails, I realized this was even uglier than I thought. It wasn't just the one large sum I had discovered. Over the past 6 months, Mike had transferred money to Jessica multiple times. Some were for a few $100s, some for a few thousand, sometimes just days apart. Each time, the description was vague. For shopping, urgent matter, advance, help transfer. But among all the transactions, one line made me freeze for a long time. Joint investment. A joint investment with whom? An investment in what? Why would a married man take money from his family's joint account to make a joint investment with his sister-in-law? The question repeated in my head like a ticking clock against my temple. It was then that I understood something even more terrifying than an affair. This wasn't just about emotions and sex. This was about calculation. And when a dirty relationship gets mixed up with money, it no longer stops at simple betrayal. That night when I got home, I had to act even more carefully. I couldn't let Mike or Jessica see that I had more evidence. I even sat down next to my husband and said in a perfectly normal tone, I was thinking of going to my parents for a few days this weekend. My mom's been complaining about her back, and I haven't visited in a while. Mike, who was looking at his phone, looked up a little too quickly and asked, "How many days?" I replied simply, "Probably 2 or 3. He nodded, trying to look casual, but the brief flicker of light in his eyes didn't escape me. I just smiled faintly to myself. It's true what they say. Just give them an opening, and people will immediately reveal their true nature. But I had no intention of visiting my parents. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house as planned. I even called my mom beforehand and told her that if Mike asked, she should say I had stopped by. Then, I went to stay at a vacant apartment belonging to a friend from work, not far from my house. I also hired an acquaintance of David's to watch my house and report who came and went over the next 2 days. More importantly, before I left, I placed 2 small audio recorders in the living room and a corner of the kitchen, hidden well enough that no one would notice them unless they were looking. Those 2 days felt like 2 months. During the day, I was at work, but my mind was back at home. At night, in the empty apartment, I'd check the reports and listen to the audio recordings. On the second night, as I was fast-forwarding through a section with the sound of a chair being pulled out and glasses clinking, I suddenly heard Jessica's voice, quiet but no longer with the usual pitiful, sniffling tone. She asked directly, "When are you going to be done with her?" My heart felt like it was being squeezed. I sat up straight, afraid to even breathe. And then, I heard Mike's voice, low, steady, and chillingly cold. "We have to be patient. The property is still in her name." Just that one sentence. My ears started ringing, and my hands trembled so much I almost dropped my phone. All the scattered pieces from the past few months finally clicked together into a complete picture, one that was far filthier and more ruthless than I could have imagined. They weren't just sleeping together behind my back. They weren't just using the guise of sympathy to deceive me. They were also planning, waiting for the right moment to take what they wanted from me. I sat in that dark apartment for a long time. Not crying, not cursing. I no longer felt the sharp, sudden pain of being stabbed in the back. That pain was gone. In its place was something else colder, clearer, and much, much sharper. I looked at the still-lit phone screen, listened to that sentence one more time, and then slowly turned it off. It was then that I knew I had crossed the final boundary of compassion. I wasn't in pain anymore. I was cold. The coldness I felt after hearing that recording didn't keep me up at night. It made me sharper than ever. I knew that if I confronted them with everything now, at best, Mike would deny it, Jessica would cry, and my mother-in-law would once again blame it all on me being a suspicious wife. I had proof, yes, but I didn't want to play my hand just yet. I didn't just want them to admit they were wrong. I wanted their own greed to lead them to a point of no return. The next morning, I went to work as usual, but that afternoon, as soon as I got home, I initiated a conversation with Mike. My voice was light, casual, as if there had been no turmoil in my heart for days. I said, "I've been thinking, as a married couple, we should be more transparent about our assets. It's not good for everything to be in my name alone. What if something happens? Why don't we look into putting some things under both our names for long-term peace of mind?" The moment I finished speaking, Mike, who was taking off his watch, looked up sharply. His reaction was too fast, so fast that in a blink of an eye, I knew my bait had landed perfectly. He stared at me for a few seconds, then smiled. It was a forced, unnatural smile, but his eyes were gleaming. He replied almost immediately, "I was just about to bring that up with you. It's better for a couple to have everything in both names." I sat on the edge of the sofa, my face calm, but inside, I was laughing coldly. Asterisk, I was just about to bring that up. Asterisk, a phrase that sounded so warm, but to me, it was just a mask slipping halfway off. For so long, whenever I mentioned legal documents or assets, Mike would either change the subject or say we'd deal with it later. Yet today, the moment I brought it up, he latched onto it like a drowning man grabbing a piece of wood. If he hadn't already had a plan in mind, Who would be that eager? I didn't stop there. I pretended to hesitate for a moment before continuing, as if this were my real concern. There's one more thing. Someone at my company invited me to invest in a new project. I was thinking, if I pull out a large sum for it, I should get our paperwork in order first. I don't want any legal complications later on. I looked down, fidgeting with the hem of my shirt, avoiding his eyes. But I knew that every word I dropped was like a drop of gasoline on a flame. Mike was quiet for a beat, then asked slowly, "How large a sum are we talking about?" I answered casually, "Quite a bit. If I go through with it, it would probably mean dipping into our long-term savings." He nodded, pretending to think it over, but the corners of his mouth tightened ever so slightly. I recognized that kind of silence. It wasn't contemplation, it was calculation. That evening, Mike's behavior was so unusual that an outsider might have thought he was the most perfect husband in the world. After dinner, he even helped clear the table, asked about my work, and then said, "If you think it's a good opportunity, you should go for it. I'll always support you." The more I heard, the more nauseous I felt. Later that night, I didn't go to sleep right away. I lay with my back to Mike, pretending to breathe evenly, but I was waiting. Sure enough, close to midnight, his phone vibrated. He quietly slipped out of bed and went to the balcony. I didn't move, just held my breath and listened. His voice was too low to make out the words, but the tone wasn't that of someone listening to another person's troubles. It was urgent, clipped the voice of someone discussing important business. When he came back in, though he was as quiet as possible, I could smell the faint scent of cigarette smoke on his clothes. Mike only smoked when he had something major on his mind. The next morning, I pushed things a little further. I intentionally sat in the living room and made a phone call to a friend who worked at a notary's office, speaking just loudly enough for anyone in the kitchen or the yard to overhear. I said, "Yeah, I'll probably stop by this week to look at some power of attorney forms and add a joint owner. I want to be careful. I don't want to sign something and then get stuck with legal liabilities." I made sure to emphasize the words legal liabilities and signed something at the exact moment I knew Jessica was outside hanging laundry. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, as I walked past the kitchen, I saw Jessica come in to find my mother-in-law, but her eyes kept darting towards the living room. Her face no longer had that vacant look from the past few days. Instead, it was a poorly concealed anxiety. That afternoon, when I pretended to be running late at the grocery store, my contact gave me a valuable piece of information. Jessica had secretly met Mike at the end of the street. They spoke quickly, but my contact overheard one sentence from Jessica. "We have to move fast. An opportunity like this won't come again." When I heard that, I was sitting in a small cafe, and I almost laughed out loud. It turned out that the mere scent of money could make people reveal their true colors so quickly. That night, I prepared for the next step. Through David, I met someone who specialized in civil contracts. I wasn't doing anything illegal. I just had him draft a set of investment and asset agreements that were perfectly legal in form. But within them, I had him insert some very tight clauses. If the signatory engaged in any fraudulent behavior, concealed personal interests, or used joint assets for improper purposes, all resulting benefits would be immediately voided, and they would even be required to pay damages. I read every line, every word, and then smiled. However deep their greed ran, I would let that very greed be the rope that choked them. 2 days later, I announced to the family that I wanted everyone to sit down together over the weekend to clarify our financial situation and avoid any misunderstandings. My mother-in-law, hearing this, nodded in approval and even praised me. See, that's how a good wife thinks. Mike put on a serious face, but his eyes betrayed his eagerness. As for Jessica, though she sat quietly in a corner as if it had nothing to do with her, the moment anyone mentioned paperwork or investment, her posture would stiffen, and her eyes would blink rapidly. I saw everything, noted everything, but said nothing more. I wasn't revealing my hand yet. I was just letting out the line, 1 inch at a time, just enough for them to see the prize and get impatient, pushing each other to move faster. Because from the very beginning, I didn't want to drag them into a trap. I wanted them to walk into it themselves, driven by their own desires. Only then would the price they had to pay be truly deserved. And I knew that moment was very, very close. After the evening, I announced my intention to clarify our finances. The atmosphere in the house became incredibly tense. It was as if a bomb was buried under the floorboards, and no one knew when it would go off. On the surface, everything seemed the same. My mother-in-law still bustled about with her usual sharp tongue. Mike still came home for dinner on time. Jessica still came over with her sad sack face. But if you looked closely, you could see that everyone was on edge. No one was acting naturally anymore, especially not Mike and Jessica. I noticed Mike had become much more secretive. His phone was no longer left casually on the table. It was always in his pocket. If it buzzed while he was drinking water, he'd immediately get up and go outside. Jessica no longer dared to sit so openly close to Mike, but the looks they exchanged were more telling than ever. If Mike so much as coughed or stood up, her eyes would follow him. That kind of avoidance wasn't the behavior of two innocent people. It was the behavior of people who knew they were being watched, and the person watching them was none other than Kevin. After the time Mike pushed him aside to shield Jessica, Kevin's pride as a man had surely been wounded. He no longer saw things as just another impulsive fit of jealousy. He started to look closer. Before, Kevin probably suspected his wife was cheating with some stranger, but he likely never imagined the person he had to worry about was his own brother. But once the seed of suspicion is planted, it grows very quickly. I saw a clear change in Kevin. He no longer erupted in anger at the slightest provocation. Instead, he became quieter, more observant. One day, Jessica stepped out onto the porch to take a call, and I saw Kevin standing at the far end of the yard, silent, just staring at his wife's back. Another afternoon, I was hanging laundry and heard a motorcycle idling at the end of the street. I looked out and saw that Kevin hadn't gone to work as he'd said. He was parked out of sight, his eyes fixed on our house. He was starting to watch them for real. The inevitable finally happened. One night, around 9 p.m., Jessica was in a corner of the kitchen, texting, thinking no one was paying attention. But Kevin had come home silently and was standing right behind her. From the living room, I heard Kevin's low, hoarse voice. "Who are you texting that you have to hide it like gold?" Then came the sound of a chair scraping violently and a phone being snatched. I didn't even need to go in to imagine the scene. Jessica screamed, and Kevin roared like thunder. A few seconds later, the whole house was in an uproar. When I walked into the kitchen, Jessica's phone was in Kevin's hand. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. Jessica's face was drained of all color as she lunged for the phone, but it was too late. Kevin scrolled through something on the screen, then looked up, his eyes a mixture of fury and humiliation. He probably didn't find anything definitive, just a few hastily deleted messages or some ambiguous traces, but it was enough to ignite the suspicion in his mind into a full-blown inferno. "What is this? Why are you texting my brother at this hour?" Kevin bellowed. Jessica was trembling, but she quickly put on her familiar act. She burst into tears, wailing, "If you don't trust me, then fine. I've had enough of this life. You check my phone every day, you accuse me of everything. If you want to drive me to my death, just say so." That was Jessica's talent. She always knew the right moment to cry, to turn herself into the victim. Just as her sobs reached their peak, Mike walked in from outside. I don't know how much he heard, but the speed with which he inserted himself between Kevin and Jessica made me want to laugh. He grabbed Kevin's arm, his voice sharp. "That's enough. If you have a problem, talk it out. Is hitting a woman the best you can do?" Kevin turned to face his brother, his eyes looking like he wanted to tear him apart. "Don't you defend her. You're the one who needs to explain yourself." He enunciated each word, and I knew right then that the conflict between the two brothers had reached a point where they could no longer pretend it didn't exist. My mother-in-law rushed in to intervene, repeating the same old lines. Kevin was crazy, Jessica was suffering, and Mike was just being a good brother by stepping in. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Kevin wasn't acting like his usual reckless self. He stared at his brother with suspicion-filled eyes, and Mike, though he tried to act innocent, grew more agitated the more he spoke. Only Jessica was crying a river, looking so pitiful that an outsider might have felt sorry for her. I stood in the corner, watching it all, and a strange sense of calm washed over me. I realized that this filthy relationship was starting to implode. I didn't need to do much. Just one more push in the right place, and everything would explode. And I knew I had to be the one to give that gentle push. The next morning, while Kevin was sitting on the porch smoking, his face gaunt from a sleepless night, I intentionally brought him a glass of water. I didn't mention the previous night's events. I just sat down, sighed as if I too was exhausted, and said vaguely, "You know, there are some things I don't know if I should say or not." Kevin immediately turned to look at me. Just as I expected, he was so hungry for the truth that he would snatch at any crumb. I paused for a few seconds before continuing slowly. "Don't get mad at me for meddling, but Mike has been helping Jessica with money lately. I thought you already knew." Just that one sentence. Kevin's expression changed completely. He didn't say anything, but the hand holding the cigarette tightened so much that it snapped in two. The anger in his eyes shifted to something darker, sharper. This time, his suspicion was finally aimed at the right person. I stood up without another word. Some things don't need to be said outright. You just need to drop one piece of information and let the suspicious person connect the rest of the dots with his own shame and pride. As I walked back inside, I heard the sound of the plastic chair being shoved back violently. I didn't turn around. I just allowed myself a small, knowing smile. Because at that moment, I understood one thing very clearly. I didn't need to destroy them anymore. They were going to destroy each other. After I dropped that casual comment to Kevin on the porch, everything in the house accelerated, like a machine that had just been kicked into a higher gear. I could see the change in everyone. Mike was no longer just cautious. He was becoming anxious. Jessica had completely dropped her innocent, pitiful act, replaced by a constant look of fear, as if she was always waiting for something to shatter. And Kevin, who had once been a man of nothing but loud, directionless anger, was now terrifyingly quiet. He didn't say much anymore, but his silence was what made everyone else uneasy. As for me, I knew it was time to close the trap. I had almost everything I needed. The video from the bedroom, the audio recording of Mike and Jessica discussing my assets, the bank statements showing the money transfers, the recovered text messages, and a few other audio files I had collected from the house. I sat alone in my room, laying everything out, listening to each clip, marking key moments, and writing down a timeline. I couldn't afford any mistakes. I knew that to expose them completely, I couldn't rely on emotion alone. I needed evidence, a clear sequence of events, and a final blow that would leave them no room for denial. And, as if on cue, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Thanksgiving was in 3 days. Every year, it was a massive affair, with the whole extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, all gathered at the house. It was a reunion where even a small piece of gossip could spread through the entire family in an afternoon. I didn't need to choose another venue. The family's own Thanksgiving dinner would be the most fitting stage to rip off every single one of their masks. That evening, at dinner, I spoke up, my voice so calm that it even surprised my mother-in-law. I said, "I've thought it over. After Thanksgiving, I think I'll get the paperwork started to transfer the assets in my name over to Mike. After all, we're going to be together for the rest of our lives, so it doesn't really matter whose name is on what." As I finished speaking, the chopsticks in Mike's hand paused mid-air. It was brief, but I saw it. My mother-in-law looked up, her initial surprise quickly replaced by a look of smug satisfaction. She even cleared her throat and said in a sickly sweet voice, "See, that's how a sensible woman thinks. The husband is the head of the household. It's better to let him manage things than to hoard them yourself." I looked down at my bowl, serving myself more soup as if nothing had happened. But across the table, Jessica was sitting perfectly still. I could see the flush rising up her neck, her eyes blinking rapidly. She didn't dare look at me, but her fingers were gripping her spoon so tightly her knuckles were white. It was her barely concealed excitement that I found so amusing. She had no official claim to my assets, yet she was more anxious about them than anyone. From that day on, Mike and Jessica's impatience became obvious. They couldn't wait any longer. The person I had watching them reported that in just 2 days, they had met 3 times at the end of the street and at a coffee shop near the market. These weren't the long, complaining sessions of before. They were short, urgent meetings, and they would part ways immediately after. At night, the recorder I had planted in the living room captured more snippets of their conversations. The more I listened, the more I was convinced that greed makes people incredibly careless. In one clip, Jessica's voice was low but urgent. What if she finds out? I sat in the dark, my earbuds in so deep they hurt, but I could still hear my own heart pounding. Then Mike's voice came through, low and confident. She won't. She's too stupid. Just that one sentence. I had to pull my earbuds out, set the phone down, and sit in silence for a long time. I thought I was past the point of being hurt by him. But it turns out, some words don't make you cry. They just feel like someone is stomping on your self-respect. Asterisk, stupid. Asterisk. So, after all these years together, in the eyes of the man who slept next to me, I was just a stupid woman, easy to lead, easy to deceive, easy to rob, and then kick to the curb. That sentence erased any last shred of hesitation I might have had. If I had been wondering whether I should really cause a scene on Thanksgiving, after hearing that, I had nothing left to hold back for. I wasn't the one destroying their family. They had already smashed it to pieces long ago. Meanwhile, Kevin wasn't sitting idly by. After I had pointed him in the right direction, he started tailing Jessica almost every day. One afternoon, he came home late, thinking no one noticed, but I saw his car parked discreetly behind a row of bushes down the street. One evening, he stood in the yard for a long time, his eyes glued to the living room window where Mike had just stepped out to take a call. Kevin wasn't starting loud fights anymore, and that's what I found most dangerous. A man who only knows how to throw punches. Once he starts to stay silent and observe, it means he is utterly convinced that something very dirty is happening. I knew it was time to meet with him alone, not to tell him everything, but to push him right to the edge of the truth. The afternoon before Thanksgiving, I asked Kevin to meet me at a small diner at the edge of town, choosing a time when it was getting dark and no one we knew would be around. He looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and impatience. I didn't beat around the bush. I took out my phone and played him a short audio clip. Just the part where Jessica says, "When are you going to be done with her?" and Mike's reply about the property. That was all. I didn't show him the video, the bank statements, or tell him everything else I knew. After listening, Kevin's face went from pale to beet red in a second. He shot up from his seat, knocking the plastic chair over. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought I could hear his teeth grinding. "Give me everything," he growled. I remained seated, looking him straight in the eye. Not yet. Kevin leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if he wanted to break it. "What are you waiting for? They've been sleeping together behind our backs." I replied slowly, each word deliberate. "If you want the whole truth, you'll wait for Thanksgiving." He froze. The madness was still in his eyes, but I knew he was listening. I continued, my voice low and cold. "If you make a scene now, they'll just deny it again. You'll get into a fight, and you'll be the one who looks like the bad guy. But if you wait for the right time, the right place, in front of the entire family, then no one can run." Kevin was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. Then, he clenched his teeth and gave a sharp nod. That one nod was enough. I knew that all the pieces were now in place. That night, I went home, locked my bedroom door, and laid everything out one last time. The phone with the video, the audio files, the printed screenshots of text messages. I even had the names of 2 people who could serve as witnesses if needed. I stayed up late, organizing the evidence, planning which sentence to say first, when to pause, and which clip to play at which moment. I was no longer a betrayed wife crying into her pillow. I was preparing for a performance where every single one of them would be stripped bare by the truth. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Inside, everyone else thought tomorrow would be just another Thanksgiving. Only I knew that tomorrow would be the day it all ended. I turned off my phone screen, sat in the dark for a little longer, and said to myself, my voice clear in my head, Asterisk, this time, there is no turning back for anyone. Asterisk, that morning, The house was bustling with activity from early on. Family members, neighbors, aunts, and uncles started arriving before the sun was even fully up. The sounds of greetings, clattering dishes, and people calling out to each other to set up tables and chairs filled the air. The kitchen was a hive of activity, making the atmosphere seem festive. But inside, I felt a strange calm. I woke up early, chose a simple, dark-colored dress, put my hair up neatly, and applied just enough makeup to hide any signs of fatigue. People often think that a woman on the verge of doing something big will be trembling, but by then, I had nothing left to tremble about. I made a point of being helpful, arranging platters, pouring drinks, and setting out plates, speaking more softly than usual. It was this very calmness that made Mike and Jessica let their guard down. I could see it clearly. Mike kept glancing at me, trying to read my expression, but when he saw me being polite to relatives and even helping to set up extra chairs without a word of complaint, his face relaxed. As for Jessica, from morning until it was time to say grace, she barely dared to look at me. She busied herself in the kitchen, but her hands were so clumsy she spilled tea all over a saucer. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, saw my obedient, well-behaved act and grew even more confident. Standing in the middle of the yard, talking to some of the other women in the family, she raised her voice intentionally so I could hear. A woman's worth is in knowing when to be quiet and keep the family together. Making a scene only breaks a home and makes you a laughingstock. The women around her nodded in agreement. One even turned to me and smiled, as if praising me for finally learning my lesson. I was carrying a teapot past them, and I paused for just a second. "Yes, I agree," I said softly. "Some things are best clarified when the whole family is here to witness." I walked away without looking back, but I knew that sentence had made at least 3 people in that yard freeze. Mike looked up at me. Jessica's face went pale, and Kevin, standing at the far end of the yard, just took a long drag from his cigarette and ground it out on the pavement. The pre-dinner gathering proceeded as usual. The aroma of roasted turkey filled the air. Platters of food were laid out on the buffet table, and the men of the family gathered to watch football. I stood quietly in the background, my hands clasped, my eyes looking around the room, but my heart was as still and cold as the bottom of a well. If their ancestors could see their descendants today, they would never have imagined a Thanksgiving turning out like this. But it was precisely because it was Thanksgiving, precisely because the whole family was there to bear witness, that I could not back down. After a while, people started to move towards the dining room to find their seats. The scraping of chairs, the laughter of children, and the calls for everyone to sit down created a festive chaos. And in that moment, I stood up. I didn't need to tap a glass or raise my voice. The simple act of me standing in the middle of that room, holding a small folder, was enough to make the chatter die down. I looked around the room, waiting for every last pair of eyes to settle on me before I spoke. If I could have everyone's attention, I'd like to say a few words about our family and our assets. Since all the aunts, uncles, and cousins are here today, I wanted you all to be witnesses. The moment I said the word assets, several heads shot up. Most of them probably thought I was about to announce the transfer of property to Mike, as I had hinted at a few days prior. My mother-in-law even cleared her throat and sat up straighter. Mike had a slight smirk on his face, trying to look composed, but his eyes betrayed his anticipation. I gripped the folder in my hand and said, each word clear and distinct, "I used to think I could entrust our finances to my husband. But before I do that, I need to clarify one thing, whether this man is even worthy of being a husband." The entire yard went silent. No one was pulling out chairs anymore. No one was talking. I could hear the faint clink of a fork being set down at a nearby table. Mike was the first to react. He gave a forced, awkward laugh. "Kate, what's gotten into you? It's Thanksgiving. Don't make a scene." I looked him straight in the eye, feeling not a single tremor of fear. A scene? How could I possibly top the scene you two have been putting on? As the words left my mouth, I opened my phone and played the first audio recording. A slight hiss, and then Jessica's voice filled the yard, crystal clear. "When are you going to be done with her?" Followed by Mike's low, cold reply. We have to be patient. The property is still in her name. Just that short exchange was enough to make the women sitting closest to me gasp. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." My mother-in-law's face went rigid. Mike could no longer force a smile. His eyes widened in disbelief that I would dare to play that in front of everyone. Jessica was the first one to jump up. Her face was ashen, her voice cracking with panic. "That's not real. You edited it. You're framing me." I turned to look at her, seeing the tremor in her lips, and replied instantly, my voice cutting through the air. "Framing you? Your voice sounds pretty real to me. Or should I play the video of you in my bedroom for the whole family to see?" That question landed like a bomb. The whole yard seemed to freeze. A few people turned to stare at Jessica, their expressions shifting from surprise to disgust. At that moment, there was a loud crash as Kevin slammed his glass down on the table. Water splashed everywhere. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites veined and wild, the veins on his neck bulging. He pointed a shaking finger at Jessica and growled, "You bitch. Tell me, is it true about you and my brother?" But before he could lunge, Mike shot up, instinctively placing himself in front of Jessica, a reflex an innocent brother-in-law would never have. That single movement made everyone else freeze yet again. No one thought this was a misunderstanding anymore. I stood there, my phone still playing in my hand, taking in every face around me. I hadn't shown the video yet, hadn't produced the bank statements, hadn't played the more damning recordings. I had only pulled back the first layer of the curtain. But I knew it was enough for everyone in that yard to understand one thing. From that moment on, this was no longer a Thanksgiving dinner. It had become a public trial, and not a single one of them could sit down and finish their meal as if nothing had happened. The instant I took my eyes off their stunned faces, everything exploded, just as I had predicted. Kevin couldn't stay still for another second. He kicked his chair aside and lunged at Mike like a cornered animal. The thud of his feet on the patio was followed by the sickening crack of a fist connecting with his brother's face. Mike staggered backward, his hip hitting the edge of a wooden table. His lips split open, and blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. Kevin roared, his voice hoarse with rage. "You're my brother, and you slept with my wife." That accusation hung in the air, and the entire yard fell into another shocked silence. Children were pulled into corners by their parents. Aunts gasped and stood up. The uncles rushed forward, afraid the two brothers would start a brawl and ruin the entire feast. But Kevin's rage was nothing like his old, baseless fits of jealousy. This was the raw humiliation of a man who had just been publicly shamed in front of his entire family. But what stunned everyone, even more than the punch, was Jessica's reaction. She didn't run to her husband's side. She didn't try to hold Kevin back. She didn't burst into tears, wailing that she was innocent. Instead, she let out a shriek and rushed to help Mike times up. The way she frantically touched his shoulder, the way she leaned down and whispered, "Are you okay?" made the entire family stare as if they'd been slapped. An elderly great-aunt standing near the head of the table muttered, "Good heavens, so it's true." With that one sentence, the final mask was torn away. Yet, the person who disgusted me most was still my mother-in-law. In the midst of the chaos, her eldest son bleeding, her youngest son raging, her daughter-in-law cradling, her brother-in-law, she didn't slap Jessica or demand to know the truth. The first thing she did was point a trembling finger at me and screech, her voice shrill and ugly, You did this on purpose. You planned this on Thanksgiving to humiliate our family." Hearing that, I let out a cold laugh. Even at this point, all she could think about was saving face. I looked her dead in the eye and said one thing. "Did I humiliate this family, or did your son do it to himself?" My question hung in the air, and I saw a few relatives turn to look at Carol, their expressions changing. Mike, meanwhile, pushed himself up, wiping the blood from his lip, still trying to fight back. He turned to the crowd, pointing a finger at Jessica, his voice shaking but still trying to play the victim. "Everyone, you're only hearing Kate's side of the story. It was her." Jessica came on to me. I only felt sorry for her because Kevin was hitting her, abusing her, so I was just being kind. Hearing that, I knew if I let him continue, he would twist the story and blame it all on a weak woman. I didn't give him the chance. I took a second phone I had prepared, tossed it onto a nearby table with a clatter, and pressed play. The screen lit up. Even in the daylight, the image from my bedroom was clear enough for everyone to see. The whole family watched Mike open the door, saw Jessica follow him in, and then saw him pull her in by the waist. At that point, some people turned away, but I let the video run. Mike stroked Jessica's hair, leaned down to kiss her forehead, while Jessica rested her head on his chest, like a woman accustomed to being pampered. There was nothing left to deny. No comfort, no pity, no seduction. The truth was right there on the screen, raw and shameful, right in front of the entire family. My mother-in-law stared at the phone, her face drained of all color. Her usually sharp, painted lips just trembled, unable to form a single word. When Kevin saw the video, he truly lost it. He broke free from the uncles holding him back and lunged for Jessica, grabbing her by the throat. His grip was so tight that her face instantly began to turn purple. Several men had to rush in and pry his fingers off, holding him back again. Jessica, after a fit of coughing, reverted to her old tricks. She started wailing as if she were the most pitiful person there, but this time, in her panic, she exposed herself. Sobbing, she pointed at Mike. "It wasn't my fault. Mike promised he would marry me. He promised he would set me up in my own place." That sentence was like another bomb dropped on the crowd. I didn't let the stunned silence pass. I took a step forward, my voice sharp and cold. "Set you up with whose money? With the money he stole from my joint account?" With that, I pulled the printed bank statements from my folder and slapped them down on the table. Page after page, with dates, amounts, transaction details, and recipient names, all laid out in black and white. This was no longer just an accusation, it was proof. The aunts who had been whispering in disbelief now fell silent. An older uncle at the main table slammed his hand down. "Disgraceful!" he roared at Mike. "How can you face your family after this?" From that moment, the mood in the yard shifted from shock to open contempt. But I knew I was still missing one final blow against Jessica. In the eyes of many, she could still be seen as a foolish girl led astray by her older, more powerful brother-in-law. I wouldn't give her that escape. I opened my phone again, pulled up the text messages David had recovered, and read them aloud for everyone to hear. "You better hurry up. I'm not staying with Kevin another day. And don't you forget about the car and the money you promised me." After I finished reading, the yard was dead silent. No one looked at Jessica with pity anymore. The crying, helpless woman was not just a cheater, she was a calculating opportunist, planning her next move. Jessica froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Mike's face was ashen. My mother-in-law collapsed into a chair, her shoulders shaking, not out of sympathy for anyone, but because for the first time she had no words left to defend her family. At that point, in front of everyone, all the acts had fallen apart. No one was a victim anymore. Mike was a traitor, Jessica was a schemer, and Carol was the blind mother who had enabled it all. But I knew the biggest explosion was yet to come. I looked around the yard, letting the heavy silence press down on every face. That silence was precious. It was the moment after the shock, before they could invent new lies to save themselves. I took one step back, placed my hand on the edge of the table, and spoke slowly, each word like a nail being hammered into the silence. If this was just about an affair, I wouldn't have chosen today to speak. What I wanted to expose is that you weren't just sleeping together. You were planning to leave me with nothing. My words sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the crowd. People looked at each other, some thinking they had misheard. An affair was dirty enough, but if it involved a conspiracy to steal a house and assets, it was no longer a simple marital breakdown. It was a story of moral bankruptcy, deception, and outright theft within the family. I didn't let the murmurs last long. I opened my folder and pulled out 2 sets of documents, placing them firmly on the table. One was the set of fake investment and asset agreements I had used as bait for Mike. The other was a photocopy of the real legal paperwork he had secretly taken to consult a lawyer. I placed the 2 sets side by side, flipped to the relevant pages, and spoke clearly. I dangled the possibility that I was ready to sign everything over, and just as I thought, he got impatient. Through an acquaintance at a notary's office and a friend who helped me check his call history, I know he secretly took our property documents to a lawyer to find out how to transfer ownership of the house solely into his name. Mike's ashen face turned ghostly white. He blinked rapidly, his hands, which had been hanging limply at his sides, clenched into fists. I looked directly at my husband, no longer addressing him with any term of endearment. You took samples of my signature from old documents. You had someone draft fake power of attorney forms. You were just waiting for me to be careless, for me to sign one wrong paper, and it would all be over. Isn't that right? The family erupted again. An older uncle stood up, leaning on the table, his eyes wide. Good Lord, it went that far, Mike stammered, his usual smoothness completely gone. Kate, who told you that? I haven't done anything. I cut him off, giving him no room to retreat. You haven't done anything times yet, asterisk. It's not that you didn't plan to. With that, I played the audio clip I had listened to countless times the night before, making sure I hadn't missed a single word. Mike's voice filled the yard, so clear that even those at the furthest tables could hear. Once the house is in my name, it'll be too late for her to do anything. When we divorce, I'll just have to toss her a little cash, and it's done. This time, no one could stay seated. Curses erupted from several directions. An old woman pressed her hand to her forehead, crying, "Oh, my heavens!" The uncles turned to look at Mike as if he were a stranger. This level of filth was no longer about cheating. It was a calculated plot, a trap laid with months of planning, paperwork, and money. At that moment, Kevin didn't lunge forward again. He stood in the middle of the yard, his chest heaving, and then he let out a laugh. It was a dry, twisted sound that was chilling to hear. He looked at his brother, then at his wife, his voice raw. Brilliant. One of you sleeps with my brother. The other one plans to steal my sister-in-law's house. I really am the biggest fool in this family. Even then, my mother-in-law tried to save her son. She staggered to her feet, clinging to the table, forcing a calm tone. He just said that in a moment of anger. Men say stupid things sometimes. I turned to look at her, my heart like a block of ice. If she was just defending her son out of blind love, perhaps she could be pitied. But she wasn't blind. She knew. And I had waited for this exact moment to pull back the final curtain. I took out a third phone and played the footage from our front door security camera. The image wasn't close-up, but it was clear enough for everyone to recognize Carol, sneaking a look around before handing Mike a brown file folder. The audio was slightly distorted, but her voice was unmistakable. Get it done quickly. The longer you wait, the more can go wrong. The moment her voice rang out, the yard fell into a true, dead silence. Not whispers, but a complete hush, as if they had just witnessed the unbelievable. My mother-in-law froze, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. Immediately, the criticism turned on her. A cousin pointed a finger, her voice sharp as a whip. You're a mother, and you encouraged your son to steal from his wife? I've never seen such shame. Another uncle just shook his head repeatedly. This family is broken, rotten from the roots. I stood there, watching Carol. For the first time, I saw the woman who had always been so sharp-tongued, who loved to lecture others on morality, now cowering before the very people she had tried so hard to impress. But I wasn't done. Jessica, seeing the tables had completely turned, switched allegiances with the speed of a snake trying to save its own skin. She dropped to her knees, crying and pointing at Mike. He tricked me too. He promised that after he got the house, he'd open a salon for me. He told me to just wait a little longer. He said, she hesitated for a second, then blurted it out. He said Kate was a principled idiot whose weakness was trusting her husband. That sentence landed like another stinging slap. Even though I had heard a similar line in the recording, hearing it said so bluntly in front of the entire family still cut me deeply. Not because I still loved him, but because I had once been so sincere with a man who despised me so thoroughly. By this point, all three of them, Mike, Jessica, and Carol, had been completely exposed. There were no more excuses, no more places to hide, no one with enough dignity left to face their relatives. But I hadn't finished yet. I gripped my purse, feeling the final set of documents inside, and lifted my head. I knew I had one more move to make, one that would push them from a state of humiliation into complete and utter defeat. I looked at the three people standing before me, a man who was once my husband, a woman who once called me her sister, and another woman who had lectured me on how to keep a home and felt nothing. The most terrifying thing about a woman isn't when she cries or screams in agony. It's when she has cried enough, hurt enough, and become clear-headed enough that she no longer needs anyone's pity. I slowly reached into my purse, pulled out the final folder, and placed it on the table in front of Mike. The sound of the folder hitting the wood was soft, but in the dead silent yard, it was like a knife plunging into the last remnants of his dignity. I looked him straight in the eye and spoke, my voice even and clear, without a trace of a tremor or a catch in my throat. I didn't come here to ask for pity. I came here to give you back your true self. With that, I pushed the folder a little closer to him. Sign it. If you sign today, you can leave with a shred of dignity. If you don't, tomorrow I will file a police report with all this evidence for fraud and attempted asset theft. It was only then that I saw true fear in Mike's eyes. The defensive anger, the victim act, the smug confidence that he could outsmart me, it was all gone. For a man like him, an affair could be blamed on a woman, on circumstances, on a moment of weakness. But when it came to legal documents, property, and fraud, that was a different story. That was something that could lead to serious consequences. Mike's lip twitched. He swallowed hard and, for the first time in a very long time, lowered his voice. It wasn't the voice of a husband speaking to his wife. It was the voice of someone begging for mercy. Kate, I was wrong. Give me another chance. I almost laughed. A chance? This man had the audacity to ask for a chance after everything he had done. I stared at him, unblinking, and replied flatly, I gave you chances for years. You used them to sleep with your sister-in-law and plot to throw me out on the street. My words hung in the air, and the yard fell silent again. No one could argue because everyone knew it was the truth. Jessica, who had been hoping to cling to Mike for salvation, saw him crumble and immediately changed her target, a habit for someone who only knew how to survive by latching on to the stronger person. She scrambled over to Kevin, collapsing at his feet, her hair a mess, tears and snot smearing her face as she grabbed his pant leg. Kevin, I was wrong. I made a mistake. Please, forgive me this one time. But Kevin was no longer the man who only knew how to erupt in a blind rage. After being so thoroughly humiliated, his eyes were frighteningly empty. He looked down at Jessica as if she were something both disgusting and foreign. Then he spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. You don't have to ask. From now on, you're dead to me. The words were short, but colder than any slap. Jessica let go of him, as if all her strength had vanished. My mother-in-law, seeing her eldest son about to sign away everything and her youngest son disowning his wife, truly panicked. She lunged for the folder on the table, her voice no longer composed, just a shrill scream. You've gone too far. Are you trying to ruin your husband? You heartless woman! But before she could even touch the papers, one of the older aunts stepped in front of her, her voice firm. It's not your daughter-in-law who is heartless. It's you and your son who have no morals. No one else in the family defended her. Some turned away, some shook their heads, some sighed. For the first time in all her years of ruling this family, Carol was completely abandoned by her own relatives. I knew it was time for my final move, one that not even Mike could have anticipated. I turned to look at him, then slowly scanned the faces of everyone in the yard, my voice still steady but sharp as a newly honed blade. Oh, and there's one more thing you probably don't know. 3 days ago, I froze your access to our joint accounts. I also filed a request to suspend any and all transactions related to the house and gave my lawyer power of attorney over all the original documents. I paused, letting the words sink in. In other words, you have nothing. You lost everything at the very moment you thought you were about to win. I saw the strength drain out of Mike. His shoulders slumped, his eyes went vacant. The calculating, clever man I once knew seemed to collapse. He understood. He understood that the web he had been weaving for months, the money, The house, the affair, the promises, the fake documents had all come crashing down. The money was inaccessible. The house was untouchable. His lover was on her knees before his brother. His mother was being shamed by the entire family. He thought he was winning the game, but I had already checkmated him before his final move. I looked at him one last time and delivered my final line in front of everyone. You thought I was stupid because I was silent. But the most pathetic person is the one who thinks silence means ignorance. After saying that, I felt a massive weight lift from my chest. It wasn't the petty satisfaction of winning. It was the feeling of finally reclaiming my own justice. Just as I was about to pick up my purse, Kevin stepped forward again. This time, he didn't hit or curse. He stood before me, his eyes red, but his voice was low and hoarse. Kate, I've been a real piece of work, but this time I want to offer you a sincere apology. I couldn't control my own wife, and I let you get dragged into this mess. I looked at him for a moment. It was the first time I had ever seen Kevin truly bow his head, not out of fear, but because he finally understood how wrong he had been. I didn't say I forgave him, nor did I offer any comfort. I just gave a slight nod. That was enough. Then I picked up my purse and walked out of that house. No one stopped me. No one had the right to. Behind me, the house was still standing. The walls were intact, the roof was sound, and the scent of Thanksgiving dinner still lingered in the air. But I knew that from the moment I walked through that gate, the thing they called honor, for every single person left standing in that yard, had completely and utterly crumbled. After that fateful Thanksgiving, everything ended quickly, without the prolonged drama I had anticipated. Perhaps when the truth is laid so bare, there's nothing left to fight for. Mike didn't resist. He signed the divorce papers faster than he'd ever signed a business contract. His hand trembled slightly, and he couldn't look me in the eye, not out of lingering affection, but because he knew he had lost. He hadn't lost because I was smarter, but because he had backed himself into a corner with no way out. Kevin threw Jessica out of the house that same day. I heard from neighbors that she stood outside the gate for hours, crying until her voice gave out, but he never opened the door. That door wasn't closed in a fit of anger. It was closed because a final line had been crossed. But life isn't a fairy tale where a betrayer is welcomed into another's arms. Mike immediately cut all ties with her. He was too busy trying to salvage what was left of his own reputation to get further entangled. From a woman who thought she was upgrading her life, Jessica fell to rock bottom with nowhere to go. My mother-in-law was no longer the loud, overbearing woman she once was. She became quiet, not out of remorse, but because she had lost the face to speak. I heard that at subsequent family gatherings, people no longer greeted her warmly. They would look, then turn away, and whisper. For a woman who lived her entire life for appearances, that was likely the heaviest price of all. Mike lost more than he ever imagined. It wasn't just his family, but his reputation. The story of him trying to fraudulently transfer the property and the recordings of his schemes eventually leaked out. His business suffered. Old contacts grew distant. No one had to say it to his face. A single look of distrust was enough to show that they no longer saw him as the man they once knew. Some cracks can never be repaired. Of all of them, Kevin was the only one who gave me a moment's pause. Not out of pity, but because the last time I saw him, there was something different in his eyes. The recklessness was gone, as was the possessiveness of a man who treated his wife like property. He was quieter, more subdued. Perhaps, after everything, he had begun to understand that if he hadn't been so impulsive, so irrationally jealous, and so controlling, things might never have spiraled so far. But understanding doesn't mean you can turn back time. At least he knew where he had gone wrong. As for me, many people thought I had won. But I never saw it as a victory. I simply took back what was rightfully mine. The truth, my assets, my self-respect, and most importantly, the right to walk away from a toxic relationship with my head held high. That isn't a loud celebratory win. It's a quiet peace that comes from knowing you owe no one anything. Someone once asked me if, after all that, I still felt hatred. I thought for a moment and answered softly, I used to. But then I realized, when people betray each other, their own lives become the punishment. Saying that, I felt a great lightness. To hate is to remain chained to the past. To let go is to truly be free. I moved to a new place, not too far away, but far enough that I wouldn't have to see the old faces. I focused on my work, decorated my small apartment, and got used to evenings where I wasn't waiting for someone to come home, wondering what new lie I was being told. The first few days were lonely, but I soon realized that the silence wasn't as scary as I'd thought. In fact, it allowed me to be more myself. Only once did Mike try to see me. He stood at my door, no longer looking as put together as he used to, and said in a hoarse voice, "I've lost everything." I looked at him for a moment and replied slowly, "No, what you lost wasn't taken by me. It was traded away by you." With that, I gently closed the door, not for revenge, but to close a chapter of my life I never wanted to revisit. Sometimes, I still think about what happened, but the memories no longer feel heavy. I'm not grateful for the ordeal, no one would ever wish for such a thing. But I am grateful for the day I found the clarity to walk away from it, because from the wreckage of what I thought was a ruined life, I managed to find myself again.